So, Chris, let's start off real quick before we even get into IMO, before we get into any of that stuff. Tell me just really quick about yourself, kind of like where you come from, how you got here, that type of stuff.
Sure. So I'm Chris Peckham. I'm the Director of Operations here at Aborn Co. Prior to coming on at Aborn, I've been on the shipper side of the desk for about 19 years. So spent about half of that with the Adidas Group. I was an AVP of Transportation with the Senior Retail Group. And most recently, prior to coming here, Director of Supply Chain for Shark Ninja.
All right, great. So you've been around, you kind of understand the logistics industry and stuff. Let's talk IMO 2020. When I first kind of started, you said that to me first thing. It was like IMO is going to be a big thing. What is IMO 2020? Talk me through this. Why would shipping and boats and stuff matter when it comes to logistics domestically?
Sure. So the IMO 2020, this is legislation that was approved by the International Maritime Organization. And essentially what it mandates is that ocean freight carriers, ocean freight providers need to use a low sulfur fuel. So ocean freight carriers are one of the biggest contributors to air pollution overall, and it's due to the type of fuel or bunker that they currently use. So IMO 2020 is going to require this ultra low sulfur fuel. And what the residual effect of that is that you've got refineries who are producing all types of oil and fuel today. They're
Right.
doing diesel fuel, jet fuel, home heating oil, and your bunker that's used for ocean freight providers. Now we're introducing a new fuel. And essentially what that's going to do, if you think about it in its most simplest terms, is that you've got resources, assets, distillates that are being allocated to these other type of fuels that now we need to allocate to this ultra low sulfur fuel, this marine gas oil. So the expectation is that there's going to be a negative impact on these other types of fuels, diesel, home heating, jet fuel. And obviously the big impact is going to be on ocean freight shipping. So the estimated increase in cost, again, these are all estimates, and you're talking about a bunch of different trade lanes, whether it's Asia to Europe, Asia to US, exports from the US, is about 20% per shipment. Now that can be very significant depending on what you're importing.
Right. So talk to me about the options, as I've been trying to do some reading and stuff. And from what I understand, there's really kind of two realistic options of how this is going to go down, even though there's a lot of kind of doom and gloom out there, and a lot of people really not saying anything. Tell me kind of, if I was to read up on this, what are just the options that are going to occur for this?
Yeah. So the ocean freight providers really have two different avenues that they can go down. One, they can buy the new marine gas oil, which costs about $200 per metric ton more than the high sulfur fuel that they were previously buying. Or they can install scrubbers. Scrubbers, high cost to have these installed, and it takes a while. So initially, these were costing anywhere between $5 to $10 million, and it lays up a ship for 4 to 6 weeks. Now, the cost of installation of these has since come down, based on everything that I've seen,
Right.
to more of the $3 to $5 million range. So what installing these scrubbers allows the carriers to do is continue to buy the high sulfur fuel content, but all the emissions meet the standards of the IMO 2020. Now, most carriers initially determined that installing the scrubbers was not cost competitive. It just didn't make any sense. So the estimated impact on this new MGO is anywhere from $15 to $20 billion in the maritime industry. So it's huge.
Okay.
But now that we see sort of economies of scale impacting here and the cost of the scrubbers coming down, now more carriers are saying, well, geez, 3 to 5 million per vessel, that's still a huge investment. And right now, about 16% of the global maritime providers, which equates to about a third of total global capacity, are now going down the route of the scrubbers. Now, what makes that interesting is that if scrubbers didn't exist and everybody just had to use the new marine gas oil, so now there's an estimated impact on the cost of diesel fuel for those reasons that we talked about earlier. People are estimating anywhere from 20 to 30% impact on the cost of diesel.
Because the refineries have to be focused on the new MGO.
Simplest way to put it, yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So you've got that residual impact on the cost of diesel. Now, if the cost of scrubbers is actually becoming more economically viable, then maybe that impact isn't quite as big on the cost of diesel.
Right. So that's sort of the best case scenario.
Right.
And currently it's starting to look like that could be the thing that's going to occur. But I think the thing that I've been reading up, what's interesting is what the worst case scenario is, because that seems to have such a huge trickle down effect.
Yeah.
That it's something that it's fascinating when you really start to, like, if you think about it, it's something that, like, wow, this really could be a huge problem.
Absolutely.
If the worst case scenario. So talk me through what this worst case scenario is, what you're talking about with the increased diesel costs and everything.
So what's funny about this entire thing is that everybody is expecting a blip in the cost of other fuels, let's call them. And let's just focus on diesel.
Okay.
Right? So that's going to impact American, small package, LTL, intermodal, and truckload pricing.
Right.
Everybody's estimating there's going to be an impact. Nobody's really digging in and saying, this is what the impact's going to be. This is why it's going to be this. And this is how long it's going to last. And that's another critical one. That's a really, really critical factor.
Right.
But let's just assume that cost of diesel goes up by 25%.
Well, real quick, why is no one saying this? Is it just one of those, like, I don't want to put myself on the line, especially because this is such an insane new scenario we've never gotten to experience? Why? Because, like, trying to read up on this, it's hard. It's really hard to understand what people are saying. So why is no one really pushing themselves one way or the other? Why aren't they trying to go out there and say, hey, this is what we think is going to occur?
I think there's just so many unknowns. And even in all my conversations with some senior level folks at some of the big NVOCCs and the carriers direct, I've asked them, I was like, so what types of conversations are you having with your customers about how bunker is going to be calculated? Because the big thing is most customers, and this goes back to my days and being on that side of the desk, I could deal with the increases, but what I needed was information. So I could go back internally and I could sell that internally,
right,
usually with my finance people,
right,
and saying, yeah, we got to increase our ocean freight budget by 20% this year. And here are 15 bullet points, nice and kind of watered down to make you understand this is a very real thing. And this is why it has to happen. And none of these carriers have any sort of schedule. And then this goes back maybe a month or two. So they may have developed something more. But none of these carriers have a bunker schedule that really shows this is going to be what it's indexed to. This is how we're going to measure it. So, if it's going to be the average weighted cost per metric ton, like it used to be, that's fine. But they're not even sure what the cost of a metric ton of this new MGO is going to be. So there's so many moving parts, and I think people just don't. There's so many unknowns.
Right.
There really are.
So I guess let's go back to what we were saying before. I said why no one's really talking about this. So worst case scenario, they don't know what it's going to cost, but where? Yeah.
So if we use an example of, cost of diesel goes up 25%.
Right.
Right now, the national average on highway diesel cost is $3.01. Okay. Now, let's use truckload for an example. Truckload fuel is calculated on a cost per mile. So I was looking at a particular lane that some of our clients move a lot of freight in. It was about a little over 1,100 miles. Now, what a carrier will send you is they'll send you a line haul cost, and they'll also send you a fuel cost, but it's always based on their fuel schedule. And again, the fuel schedule is going to be in a cost per mile. Here at Aborn, we have a separate fuel schedule that's always much more competitive than what normal carriers will just send you as a shipper. So for a great example is in this exact lane, a little over 1,100 miles, based on the national highway cost of diesel of $3.01, that would equate to 31 cents per mile, or about $350 in fuel for that lane, based on our schedule.
Okay.
A typical average carrier fuel surcharge schedule is going to be about 41 cents per mile, right? So that number goes from $350 to $471. So now you're paying a little under $70 more per load just because of a crappy fuel schedule. Now, if you increase the cost of diesel by 25%, and it goes to $3.01 to $3.76, based on our fuel schedule, you'd pay a little under $500. And based on a carrier fuel schedule, you'd be paying 51 cents per mile, or just under $600. So about $100 extra per load because of fuel surcharge schedule that a carrier will give you versus one that's negotiated like we do for our clients. So that's, if you ship enough volume, that's significant. I mean, that's really significant.
Right. But now talk about, that's fascinating, especially because if you look at the historical data, from what I'm understanding, when the cost of diesel goes up and there's a spot market depression, a lot of trucking companies go out of business. It's a hard way for those small owner operators, small fleet to kind of stay in business when they're dealing with these types of macroeconomics.
Yep.
So then all of a sudden we're getting a capacity crisis. Am I correct?
Yeah. So that's perfectly said. So what you see is that some of these small owner operators, and in the truckload space, you've got tens of thousands of carriers in the U.S. It's a very fragmented industry,
Right.
and a lot of these guys are going to have really small fleets or owner operators, and they don't have contracts with the oil companies. They're not paying the rack rate. They're paying at the pump, just like you or I.
Right.
Now you see a spike in diesel go from $3 to $3.76. At some point, they're not going to be able to recoup all those costs, because traditionally they would just push that through to their customers. But if their customers have agreements with a big truckload carrier, say like a JB Hunter or Schneider or somebody like that, a Swift, they're going to be more insulated from that. So you may just see truckers exit the industry overall.
Right.
If you go back to when the tax breaks were allotted, a lot of these carriers did the right thing in that they invested that money into their employees to help drive up salaries and retain drivers, and they invested heavily in equipment. Right. But we've definitely seen an economic slowdown. So capacity is still very loose right now in the U.S.
Okay.
So you're dealing with excess capacity. So there's just less freight kind of moving out there. You've got this pending impact on diesel, which could possibly drive out carriers, which is just going to, now it'll start to shrink some capacity. But now you've got this whole macroeconomic thing, like we were chatting about yesterday. It was announced that there's an inverted yield curve. And the inverted yield curve, it just means that your 2-year bond, the interest on your 2-year bonds is now exceeding your 10-year bonds. And why that's important is that since 1955, every time this inverted yield curve has occurred, there's been a recession to follow. Right. So now you've got a potential recession on the horizon, which just means, again, less freight out there, pending higher diesel costs. You may see truckers exit the industry. It's just crazy what could potentially happen here.
And then I was reading a report too from let me get the name of it. It was sorry, you had math on your paper. I have literally one sheet. I can't find the dang report name. It was from Freightways Freight Intel Group. From the IMO 2020, a new higher normal for diesel prices. They said that with their like grouping, right? They said owner operators and small fleets, the group that's most at risk, have all kind of decided not to prepare.
Right.
So in theory, you have this, hopefully the best case scenario, the scrubbers work and all that stuff. But in theory, this really bad scenario could be on the horizon. What's a shipper to do? I know it's that worry that you've received a couple of worries like that in email and stuff like that. What is kind of the thing that they should be preparing for?
Yeah, and I read that same survey, and it says that most carriers are just going to try to ride it out, and that's really rolling the dice. I mean, there's not a heck of a lot that you can do. I mean, if I was a carrier, I'd try to get some negotiated fuel agreements with some of the big oil providers. As a shipper, somebody who's going to have to absorb that cost for all intents and purposes, the first thing I would do is I would meet with all my carriers, whether it was an ocean freight carrier, an air freight carrier, a less than truckload, or small package. And I would take a good hard look at my fuel surcharge schedule. And you can try to do some creative things where you put a ceiling and a floor on it and tie it to something, whether it's the cost of diesel. So if diesel goes up by X amount, my fuel surcharge cannot exceed something.
Right.
You try to put a cap on it some way to protect yourself. And then the biggest thing that you can do is over communicate this internally. Go back to your finance people, go back to your executives, try to model something out where you can say, if this happens, this could be the residual impact.
How do you communicate it? I know that from everything I understand, like logistics, you guys are thinking one way, but finance guys are thinking in a whole nother type of terminology. What has been your best practices to communicating this?
Usually what snaps finance to attention is when you start to put real numbers in front of them. Right. So if you have a good understanding of, what you shipped, and let's use ocean freight in this example. If you know how many FEUs that you imported last year, say coming into the US, you can back your way into how much of your total spend was attributable to fuel. Mm-hmm. Now, if the experts come through and say that it's going to result in an overall increase of 20% per shipment, that's an easy calculation. You take your total spend, you tack on 20%, say, here's our exposure. But then I would say, this is just an estimate. Could be 30%. Nobody's really sure just yet.
Right. All right. It's fascinating. It seems like something that just it's to pay attention to. Timing wise, when do you think there's going to kind of be that turn? From what I was reading, it was like October. They think the bunker shippers are going to kind of start buying, and then
Yep.
the shippers will start buying in November. Is that of 2019? But when do you kind of think when's the sort of when do you start really diving deep into this and kind of let's see what things should be happening now?
Yeah, I think your ocean freight carriers, you'll see for anybody that's on quarterly contracts or they have a quarterly float when it comes to bunker, I think you'll see that impacted in Q4 of this year, to your point.
Right.
I think for the domestic guys on the truckload and LTL, I think you'll see that impact coming in Q1 really quickly of 2020.
All right. How long? I don't want to make you do a bunch of estimates, but what? I guess how long do you think this storm's going to be? Like, what's your kind of prediction with all this? If you're not comfortable, it's completely
Yeah, no,
fine.
it's a tough one because it's
Yeah.
not just our own economy that we need to be looking at too. I mean, you look at right now, Germany's in really tough shape
Yeah.
from an overall economy standpoint. You've got looming trade issues with China, and that's all going to factor into everything here that we're looking at. You know, the other thing too with carriers who do not install those scrubbers, the ocean freight carriers, they're going to go back to what happened before, and they're going to start slow steaming again, right? So
Yeah.
if an
Yeah.
average vessel goes at 19 knots, whatever it is, they're going to slow that down. So they burn less oil, burn
Right.
less fuel. So it's amazing the amount of things that are being impacted either directly or indirectly by IMO 2020.
Right. And you're the one keeping up on it. You're the one kind of paying attention. So I guess if our listeners or our viewers want to like learn more, how can they get in touch with you? What should they do?
Yeah, the best thing to do is just go to our website or reach out to me directly, at cpeckham@abornco.com. We're always happy to give some perspective and guidance on what we see happening from a macro or microeconomic standpoint.
Awesome, Chris. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
See ya. Thanks for watching Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn Company. As always, like and subscribe and share this with a friend. If you're interested in watching this premiere live on YouTube, we do it every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So subscribe, hit that notification button, and join me as I'll be in there talking all things freight. Thanks. Peace.